My name is Heidi Owens. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have been what people like to call the steady one. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work as a patient care coordinator at a small rehabilitation clinic, one of those roles that requires you to remember birthdays, medication schedules, and who prefers their coffee with oat milk instead of cream. I am the person families trust when emotions run high. I am the one who keeps charts straight and voices calm. If you ask the people who know me, my neighbors, my colleagues, even extended relatives, they would probably describe me as kind, dependable, soft-spoken. Some might even say I'm too forgiving. No one would describe me as someone capable of changing the course of a family story. And that's fair. I don't raise my voice, I don't slam doors, I don't throw ultimatums across dining tables. When something hurts me, I tend to fold it neatly, like a letter, and place it somewhere private until I understand it. For most of my life, I believed I had a sister, not just legally, not just by name. I believed she was woven into me by blood, by history, by something ancient and unbreakable. She was the loud one, the radiant one, the one people noticed first when we entered a room. I was the background harmony. I never resented that. At least I didn't think I did. This story isn't about rivalry. It isn't about revenge. And it isn't about dramatic betrayals shouted across hospital corridors or whispered at funerals. It's about something quieter. It's about the day I discovered that the sister I always considered my own is not related to me by blood, and how a truth about our bloodline changed everything I thought I knew, not only about her, but about myself. What followed wasn't explosive. No one stormed out, no one broke anything. There were no cinematic confrontations. Instead, there was silence. There was an observation. There were small decisions that looked harmless from the outside. And there was a shift, so subtle at first that even I didn't realize it was happening. Over time, I began to understand that being underestimated is a kind of invisibility cloak. And invisibility, when handled carefully, can become leverage. I'm not telling you this story to paint myself as a hero. I made mistakes. I stayed quiet when I should have asked questions. I protected people who didn't always protect me. But I also learned something profound about identity, loyalty, and the difference between love and obligation. If you've ever built your life around a bond you believed was unshakable, if you've ever discovered that the foundation beneath you wasn't what you thought, then maybe you'll understand why this revelation didn't break me. It clarified me. Before I take you back to who I was in that family, before the test results, before the documents, before the quiet unraveling, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever realized that the story you were living wasn't the whole story at all? Before everything changed, I occupied a very specific space in my family. Not the center, not the edge, somewhere functional. My sister, Lila, was magnetic. 3 years younger than me, but you would never guess it. She had the kind of energy that pulled conversations toward her like gravity. At family gatherings, she was the one telling animated stories about her latest business idea, or the friend who had just moved to Barcelona, or the time she almost missed a flight because she stopped to rescue someone's dog. People laughed louder when she spoke. When I spoke, people nodded. And I don't mean that bitterly. It was simply the rhythm we settled into. I was the responsible one, the organized one, the one our parents trusted with paperwork, appointments, and reminders. If something needed to be remembered, it was my job to remember it. If something needed to be fixed quietly, it was my job to fix it. Lila was the spark. I was the structure. When we were children, this dynamic felt natural. She cried louder. I cleaned up faster. She pushed boundaries. I negotiated consequences. By the time we were adults, those roles had hardened into expectation. At Thanksgiving, I set the table without being asked. Lila arrived fashionably late, kissed everyone on the cheek, and brought a dessert no one had heard of. When our mother had minor surgery, I coordinated her medications and stayed overnight at the hospital. Lila posted a heartfelt message online about family being everything. No one saw this as an imbalance, least of all me. Because invisibility doesn't feel painful when it's familiar. It feels like home. I told myself that every family needs different roles, that not everyone has to be the headline. Some of us are footnotes. Some of us are margins holding the page together. I didn't resent her brightness. I actually admired it. I believed her confidence filled spaces I didn't want to occupy. But there was something else beneath that admiration, an unspoken hierarchy. At gatherings, if Lila and I disagreed gently on something small like a travel plan or a memory from childhood, people instinctively turned to her version first. "Are you sure, Heidi?" my aunt would say. "I thought Lila said it happened differently." It was never hostile, never overt, just subtle corrections, tiny rewrites. Over time, I learned to preface my statements with disclaimers. "I might be remembering this wrong, but I could be mistaken. I'm not totally sure." It became easier to shrink my certainty than to defend it. Even in private, I protected her. When she forgot birthdays, I sent joint gifts from both of us. When she overcommitted financially, I quietly lent money without discussing repayment timelines. When she spoke dismissively about something I cared about, I told myself she didn't mean it, because sisters are allowed to be imperfect, and because I believed, deeply, that we were built from the same blood, the same lineage, the same inherited stories. I thought whatever distance existed between us was personality, not foundation. Looking back, I realized something important. I wasn't invisible because I lacked presence. I was invisible because I agreed to be. I accepted the role of supportive infrastructure, the reliable shadow, the one who absorbed friction so the family could feel smooth. It felt noble at the time. It felt like love. What I didn't understand yet was how much of that identity was built around a belief that would later fracture everything. Because when you think someone shares your blood, you tolerate things differently. You excuse yourself differently. You attach differently. And you never imagine that the ground beneath that bond could shift. But it would. And when it did, I would have to ask myself a question I had avoided my entire life. If I am not who I thought I was in this family, then who have I been all along? The first crack wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen during an argument. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out of a room. It happened on a Tuesday evening in my kitchen. Lila had come over unannounced, which wasn't unusual. She moved through life like doors were suggestions. She dropped her bag on the counter, kicked off her shoes, and began talking before she even sat down. She was excited about something, a potential investor for a wellness startup she'd been conceptualizing for months. She spoke quickly, her hands painting invisible diagrams in the air. I listened, as I always did, asked careful questions, offered practical considerations. "Have you looked into liability insurance?" I asked gently. "If you're offering physical services, you'll want coverage." She paused mid-sentence. Then she laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly, just enough. "Heidi," she said, tilting her head the way she did when she thought she was being affectionate, "you always go straight to worst-case scenarios." I smiled. "I just think it's good to plan." "Yeah, but that's why you work in administration," she replied lightly. "You're wired for logistics. I'm wired for vision." The words themselves weren't sharp. It was the tone. The way she said administration was like it was a small room with no windows. The way she said vision, like it was open sky. I felt something shift inside me, small, precise, like a paper cut. I didn't respond defensively. I never did. Instead, I nodded. "That's fair." But later that night, after she left, I sat at my kitchen table with my journal open and replayed the exchange. "You're wired for logistics." I had spent years believing that being practical was neutral, necessary, a quiet strength. But in that moment, she had reframed it as a limitation. And what unsettled me wasn't that she saw herself as the dreamer. It was that she saw me as incapable of being one. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing something I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. When decisions needed excitement, she led. When decisions needed cleanup, I followed. When family members praised her risks, they called her brave. When they described me, they used words like stable, reliable, sensible, compliments that felt like containment. One evening at our parents' house, our father was recounting a story about Lila pitching her idea to a potential partner. "She has such confidence," he said proudly. "She gets that from our side of the family." Our side. I felt a strange pause in my chest. "Confidence is inherited," my mother added thoughtfully. "It's in the blood." Everyone nodded. I swallowed. I had never considered confidence something you were born with. I thought it was built slowly, earned quietly, strengthened through discipline. But the way they spoke about it, as it flowed genetically through certain veins, made me feel like I had somehow missed the distribution. Later, when I offered a suggestion about reorganizing some financial paperwork for our parents, something I had already partially handled, my father waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that right now, Heidi. Let Lila finish explaining her expansion plan." It was subtle, a reordering of importance. And I felt it again, that tiny, precise sting, the first small cut. No one else noticed it. Why would they? Nothing had happened outwardly, no argument, no tension. But internally, something had registered. For the first time, I began to wonder if my role in the family wasn't just circumstantial. What if it were structural? What if I wasn't seen as equally rooted? The thought felt disloyal. So I buried it. I told myself I was being sensitive, that every family has different dynamics, that love isn't measured by who speaks the loudest. And yet, I started remembering moments from childhood where I was subtly compared. "She's more like us," an aunt once said about Lila when she was younger. "Heidi's different, but that's okay." Different. At the time, I took that as personality. But now, sitting alone in my kitchen, I wrote a single sentence in my journal. Why have I always felt adjacent instead of central? It wasn't an accusation. It was curiosity. And curiosity, once awakened, is difficult to silence. That night, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw. I simply began observing more carefully. Because sometimes the first cut doesn't hurt enough to make you react. It just makes you pay attention. Once you notice something, you can't unsee it. That was the quiet danger. After that evening in my kitchen, I began tracking moments. Not obsessively, not with resentment, but with the kind of attention I use at work when reviewing patient histories. Patterns matter. Small details accumulate. And there was a pattern. It wasn't cruelty. That would have been easier to confront. It was calibration. At brunch with friends, Lila would introduce me as my sister Heidi. "She's the organized one. She keeps us all functioning." She said it fondly. But the word organized began to feel like a cage. When conversations drifted toward ambition or big picture dreams, she'd glance at me with a half smile and say, "Heidi prefers things safe." I didn't. I preferred things to be stable. There's a difference. But correcting her felt unnecessary. Petty, even. So I let it pass. At family dinners, if I disagreed with her on something small, like whether we had visited Chicago in 2008 or 2009, she would respond confidently, without hesitation. "No, I'm positive it was 2009. Her certainty carried weight. Mine carried qualifiers. "I might be mixing it up," I would say, even when I wasn't. Over time, I realized something uncomfortable. I had internalized her confidence as more legitimate than my own memory. And when that happens often enough, you start editing yourself before anyone else does. I began shrinking my opinions in real time. When Lila spoke about expanding her business internationally, I had legitimate concerns about financial risk. Instead of voicing them directly, I softened everything. "Have you considered maybe possibly looking at the numbers again?" She'd laugh lightly. "Heidi, you worry too much." And everyone would smile. It was always framed as a personality contrast. Spark and structure. Vision and caution. But the imbalance was subtle and persistent. When our parents needed help reorganizing retirement documents, I handled it quietly over several weekends. Lila dropped by once, brought wine, took photos for social media, and captioned them, taking care of the people who took care of us. The comments flooded with praise. "You girls are so lucky to have each other." "Sister goals." "Family like this is rare." I read them without bitterness. But I did notice that my labor remained invisible, even in narrative. And the strange part? I defended her. If anyone hinted that she wasn't pulling equal weight, I immediately corrected them. "She's busy. She contributes in different ways. She's just wired differently." I rationalized everything, because acknowledging an imbalance would mean acknowledging vulnerability. And I wasn't ready to admit that the role I occupied might not be mutual. One evening, while going through old photo albums at our parents' house, I found something that lingered longer than it should have. 2 hospital bracelets. One was labeled with my mother's name, one labeled with Lila's. There was no bracelet for me in that box. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed mine had been lost. But when I asked casually, my mother hesitated just slightly before answering. "Oh, yours might be somewhere else." Somewhere else. It was a small pause, almost imperceptible, but it added to the quiet ledger I had started keeping in my mind. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't building a case. I was observing. And the more I observed, the more I realized something sobering. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption, as consistent minimization, as narrative framing, as described repeatedly in ways that reduce your dimensionality. And when that happens long enough, you begin to cooperate with it. You accept the version of yourself that's easiest for others to digest. I told myself this was maturity, that harmony required sacrifice, that being the stable one meant absorbing imbalance without complaint. But deep down, another thought had started forming. What if this dynamic wasn't just about personality differences? What if something more foundational explained why I always felt adjacent? I pushed the thought away every time it surfaced, because questioning blood feels like betrayal. And I was still loyal. even to a story that might not have been fully true. There's a moment in adulthood when you realize the roles you played as a child were never temporary. They were rehearsals. And somewhere along the way, they became permanent casting. I didn't consciously choose to be the responsible one. I stepped into it because someone had to. Lila was expressive, emotional, and restless. I was steady, observant. I noticed when bills were due, when moods shifted, when something in the house needed fixing before anyone else saw the crack. That difference hardened into expectation. By my early 20s, it wasn't Heidi helps. It was Heidi will handle it. If our parents argued, I mediated. If Lila felt misunderstood, I translated her feelings into softer language for everyone else. If paperwork piled up, it migrated toward me as if pulled by gravity. No one asked whether I wanted that role. They assumed it suited me, and I agreed, because agreeing felt easier than redefining. But somewhere in my early 30s, something subtle became undeniable. The role wasn't just functional, it was hierarchical. At a family barbecue, a distant cousin asked what I'd been up to lately. I mentioned that I had completed a certification in healthcare systems management, something I had worked toward quietly for over a year. Before I could finish explaining, Lila chimed in. Heidi loves certifications, she said with a grin. She collects them. The group laughed lightly, not maliciously, but dismissively, as if achievement without spectacle was a hobby. Later that afternoon, the conversation shifted to Lila's upcoming networking event. My father leaned forward, attentive. That's the kind of ambition I admire, he said. Big thinking. I remember holding a paper plate, nodding, smiling. No one meant harm, but I felt it then, clearly. My competence was expected. Her ambition was celebrated. And expectation is a quiet way of minimizing. I began noticing how often my reliability was used as emotional infrastructure. If Lila missed a family obligation, I covered. If she forgot something important, I reframed it as, she's overwhelmed. If she was abrupt with me, I absorbed it as stress. Absorbing became my reflex. Because I believe that's what older sisters do. That's what blood does. You compensate, you stabilize, you don't compete. But I started asking myself a question I had never articulated before. If I stopped compensating, what would happen? The thought unsettled me, because part of my identity was built on being necessary in invisible ways. If I withdrew, would anyone notice the gap? Or would they simply adjust around it? One evening, while helping my mother reorganize storage boxes, I came across childhood drawings. Lila's were bold, colorful, filling entire pages. Mine were precise, houses with straight lines, carefully shaded trees. My mother held them up side by side. See, she said softly, you've always been different. Different. There it was, again. I didn't ask what she meant, but something inside me began aligning pieces I hadn't consciously connected before. Different in temperament, different in presence, different from how I was described. I had always interpreted that difference as personality contrast. Now, for the first time, I wondered if it ran deeper. Not an accusation, not yet. Just awareness. And with awareness came something unexpected. Distance, not coldness. Clarity. I began experimenting quietly. I stopped automatically volunteering for tasks. I waited before filling conversational gaps. I allowed Lila's statements to stand without cushioning them. No one reacted immediately, but the air shifted. I realized then that the role I had been assigned wasn't just about who I was. It was about who everyone else needed me to be. Reliable, useful, invisible. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to continue playing it. Not out of anger, but because something deeper was stirring. A question that refused to disappear. What if I was never meant to occupy that role in the first place? What if it was assigned, not because of personality, but because of something no one had ever said out loud? I didn't have proof. I didn't have a confrontation. I only had a growing quiet certainty that the story of our family might not be structured the way I had always believed. And once you begin questioning structure, you can't return to comfort. You can only move toward the truth, slowly, silently. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't arrive at the form of a confession. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in a records office that smelled faintly of paper and dust. Our father had asked me to help retrieve some old family documents. He was updating his will. Nothing dramatic, just responsible housekeeping, as he called it. Lila had been invited to come along, but she was busy preparing for a conference, so it was just me. Of course it was. The county records building was quiet, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. I've always liked administrative spaces. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they are: structured, archived, factual. While the clerk processed our request, I sat flipping through a binder of older paperwork my father had brought. Birth certificates, insurance forms, adoption of a pet years ago, mortgage refinances, routine history. Then I saw it. A thin envelope with my name typed on the front in faded ink. Not handwritten, typed. I don't know why that detail mattered, but it did. I opened it without thinking too much. Inside was a copy of my birth certificate. I had seen it before, of course. But this version was different. There was a stamp in the upper right corner, amended record. Amended. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't feel panic. Just stillness. There, beneath my mother's name, was a notation indicating a legal modification several months after my recorded birth date. I read it twice, then 3 times. It wasn't explicit. It didn't shout answers, but it whispered a possibility. When my father returned from the counter, I held the document casually. "Why is this marked amended?" I asked, keeping my tone even. He hesitated. Not long. Just long enough. "Oh," he said, clearing his throat. "Clerical error when you were born. They corrected it later." Clerical error. I nodded. I didn't press. But something inside me had already shifted. Because I work in systems, I understand paperwork. Amendments aren't casual. They're deliberate. And in that quiet records room, with rain tapping softly against the windows, a new question surfaced, stronger than the ones before. What if the feeling of being adjacent wasn't emotional? What if it were biological? The thought didn't feel dramatic. It felt clarifying. On the drive home, I didn't confront him. I didn't call Lila. I didn't cry. Instead, I observed my own reaction. There was no anger. There was no sense of betrayal yet. There was something far more unsettling. Relief. A subtle internal exhale. As if a lifelong dissonance had just been given a possible explanation. Different. Adjacent. Not quite rooted the same way. That evening, I took out my leather journal, the one I've kept since I was 16, and wrote a single line. If this is true, everything makes sense. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't assume. But I began researching quietly. Legal amendments, birth record adjustments, adoption processes in Oregon in the late 1980s. Nothing obsessive. Just structured curiosity. And the more I read, the more plausible the unspoken became. There are many reasons a birth certificate is amended. Some benign, some foundational. The shift wasn't explosive. It was an internal recalibration. For the first time in my life, I considered that my loyalty might have been anchored in an assumption. And if that assumption was incomplete, then the rules I had lived by might not apply in the same way. I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a map, realizing the borders had been drawn incorrectly. And maps matter, because they tell you where you belong. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was anxious, but because I was thinking, if there was truth here, if there had been silence surrounding it, then I had choices. Confront immediately, ignore it, or investigate quietly. For the first time, silence didn't feel like passivity. It felt strategic. Something had shifted. Not in the family, not yet. In me. And once your internal compass adjusts, you start walking differently, even if no one else notices. There's a difference between silence that's imposed on you and the silence you choose. For most of my life, my quietness had been instinctive, a reflex shaped by harmony, by caution, by love. I stayed silent to keep the peace. I stayed silent to avoid unnecessary friction. I stayed silent because speaking rarely shifted the dynamic anyway. But after the amended record, my silence changed texture. It was no longer compliance. It was an observation. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't ask Lila questions she wasn't prepared to answer. Instead, I began gathering context the way I would prepare for a complicated patient case, methodically, privately. At work, I had access to genetic intake forms. I understood how family medical histories were structured, what information was essential, what inconsistencies looked like. So I did something small. At my next annual physical, I requested a full genetic screening panel. Not because I was sick, not because I suspected anything specific, but because data clarifies. When the nurse asked if there was a family history of autoimmune disorders, I hesitated. "I'm not entirely sure," I said. That was new. I had always answered confidently before. After the appointment, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off some documents. Lila was there, animated as usual, explaining a new partnership she was pursuing. When she saw me, she smiled brightly. "There she is, the operations department." I was smiled back. But this time, I didn't fill the conversational gaps. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I let her momentum carry itself. She faltered slightly. It was subtle. Without my stabilizing responses, her story stretched thinner. I noticed something else too. When I stopped cushioning her statements, when I allowed silence to sit after exaggerations, other people began asking clarifying questions. Not aggressively, just neutrally. And for the first time, I wasn't managing the room. I was studying it. My parents sensed something, I think. Not suspicion, just difference. "You seem quiet lately," my mother commented one evening. "I'm thinking," I replied. That was the truth. Silence, when intentional, creates space. And in that space, patterns become visible. I started revisiting memories, not emotionally, but analytically. Why were there so few photos of my mother visibly pregnant with me? Why did extended relatives sometimes reference timelines vaguely when discussing my birth? Why had that hospital bracelet only existed for Lila? Individually, none of these was evidence. Collectively, they formed a quiet constellation. I didn't feel anger toward Lila. In fact, I felt something unexpected. Distance, not coldness. Perspective. If she was biologically theirs and I wasn't, if that was the truth, then the subtle hierarchy I had sensed all my life might not have been imagined. It might have been unconscious bias rooted in bloodline. That realization didn't wound me. It liberated me. Because if I wasn't fully rooted in the same soil, then I wasn't obligated to keep watering a dynamic that diminished me. I began making small, almost invisible adjustments. I stopped covering for missed commitments. If Lila forgot something, I let the absence stand. If my parents needed help, I asked directly whether they had also asked her, not confrontationally, just evenly. At first, no one reacted dramatically, but I saw it, the recalibration. Without my constant reinforcement, the family system wobbled slightly. And what fascinated me most was this. They interpreted my quiet as withdrawal. They interpreted my neutrality as moodiness. They assumed I was going through something. They did not consider that I might simply be choosing differently. Silence. When you've been predictable your entire life, unsettles people because it removes their certainty. I wasn't punishing anyone. I wasn't building a case. I was reclaiming authorship. And underneath it all, I waited for the genetic results, not with dread, with curiosity. Whether the truth confirmed my suspicion or disproved it, one thing had already become irreversible. I had stopped accepting my assigned role as default. Silence had become a decision. And decisions, once made internally, rarely return you to who you were before. Waiting for results teaches you patience, but preparation gives waiting purpose. While everyone around me continued operating under the same assumptions, Heidi is steady, Heidi is fine, Heidi will handle it, I began building something they couldn't see. Not a confrontation, a foundation. First, I organized facts. I requested copies of my own medical records from childhood, immunizations, pediatric visits, and intake forms. Legally, I had every right. I framed it as updating personal files for insurance purposes. No one questioned it. In those records, I noticed small irregularities, references to guardian signature instead of mother, a pediatrician's note from when I was 4, mentioning adoptive parents attentive and involved. Adoptive. The word sat on the page plainly, not hidden, not encrypted, just never discussed. I felt no surge of betrayal reading it, only confirmation. And something else, compassion. If my parents had adopted me, then they had chosen me. But if they had chosen me, why had the truth never been spoken? That question lingered. Meanwhile, I quietly reviewed legal processes in Oregon during the late 1980s. Closed adoptions were common. Records are often sealed, amendments standard procedure. It aligned. Then I did something more deliberate. I requested a direct-to-consumer DNA test. I didn't announce it. I didn't involve Lila. I simply mailed it. While waiting, I began strengthening other parts of my life. I increased my retirement contributions. I scheduled meetings with a financial planner. I reviewed shared family financial arrangements. Small things, like being listed as an emergency contact or secondary account signer for certain documents. I wasn't plotting against anyone. I was reducing dependency. If the emotional architecture of my family shifted, I wanted my stability to be internal, not relational. At family dinners, I observed more than I spoke. I noticed how often our father referenced our bloodline when discussing traits. "I get my stubbornness from my father," Lila would joke. "And you inherited it?" He'd reply warmly. Inherited. The language was always genetic, never intentional. When conversations drifted to ancestry, Scottish roots, distant relatives in Ireland, no one looked at me directly. It was subtle, but it was consistent. And here's what they never noticed. My absence from those narratives had always been present. I simply hadn't labeled it. One evening, I visited an older neighbor, Mrs. Aldridge, who had known our family for decades. We were sorting through some donated books when she paused, studying me with thoughtful eyes. "You've always had a different air about you," she said gently. "Even as a little girl." Different. There it was again. But this time it didn't sting. It clarified. "What do you mean?" I asked evenly. She smiled softly. "Your parents loved you fiercely. That was obvious. But there was always intention in it." Intention. That word settled somewhere deep. Chosen, not accidental, not biological. Chosen. I drove home that night feeling steadier than I had in weeks. If the DNA results confirmed what the records implied, then my entire life hadn't been a misunderstanding. It had been an incomplete narrative. And incomplete narratives can be corrected. Quietly, strategically, without drama. The final confirmation arrived in an unremarkable white envelope. I didn't open it immediately. I made tea, sat at my kitchen table, placed the envelope beside my journal, and breathed. Because once opened, there would be no ambiguity left. No more subtle suspicion. Only data. Only clarity. And clarity changes posture. Not always outwardly, but internally permanently. I slid my finger beneath the seal and began reading. The results were precise, cold almost. Percentages, genetic markers, ethnic breakdowns mapped in clean clinical graphics. Scottish, 12%. German, 8%. Unknown regional clusters. And then, no immediate biological match to either listed parent. I read it twice. Then again, there was no dramatic soundtrack swelling in the background. No trembling hands. No tears spilling across printed data. Just confirmation. The pediatric record, the amended birth certificate, the absence from bloodline stories. All of it aligned. I wasn't biologically related to the two people I had called mom and dad my entire life, which meant Lila and I did not share blood. The sentence settled quietly in my mind. The sister I always considered my own is not related to me by blood. And strangely, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt oriented, as if a lifelong background hum had finally resolved into a clear note. I opened my laptop and logged into the extended DNA match section. There were distant relatives listed, third cousins, possible half-relations, but nothing immediate. Whoever my biological parents were, they weren't in this database. That was fine. I wasn't searching for them. Not yet. This discovery wasn't about replacing one origin with another. It was about recalibrating truth. I leaned back in my chair and asked myself something carefully. What does this change? Emotionally, the answer was layered. It explained the subtle hierarchy, the unconscious favoritism, the genetic language that had always circled around me without landing. It explained why I had felt adjacent, but it didn't automatically erase love. My parents raised me, fed me, sat beside hospital beds, paid for school supplies, attended graduations. Adoption is not absence, but silence is distortion. And that distortion had shaped my role. Because if I had known from childhood that I was adopted, if it had been spoken openly, I might have built my identity differently. I might have interpreted differences as origin, not deficiency. Instead, I internalized them as inadequacy. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I closed the laptop and reached for my journal. I wrote, I was chosen, but I was not informed. And that distinction matters. The next thought that surfaced surprised me. If this truth had been withheld from me, what else had been structured quietly? Family finances, inheritance, legal documents? Not maliciously, but structurally. Bloodline language isn't just emotional, it's legal. And I understood systems well enough to know that clarity now would prevent confusion later. The leverage I had discovered wasn't explosive. It was informational. Knowledge of my own status changed how I evaluated everything. I didn't confront my parents that week. I didn't confront Lila. Instead, I scheduled a consultation with an estate attorney. Not to challenge anything, just to understand. What rights does an adopted child have in Oregon under closed adoption laws? How are wills structured if biological and adopted children are both listed? What documentation ensures equal standing? The attorney didn't find my questions unusual. Plenty of families navigate these details. But as I left the office, I realized something profound. For the first time in my life, I was acting in my own interest, without filtering it through family harmony. Quiet dominance isn't loud. It's alignment. And alignment had just shifted permanently, because a truth about our bloodline changed everything I thought I knew about my sister. It didn't make her my enemy, but it removed the unconscious pedestal I had placed her on. She wasn't more rooted. She was simply more genetically mirrored. And that difference no longer diminished me. It differentiated me. The power in that realization wasn't something I needed to broadcast. It was something I needed to integrate. And integration requires a decision, not a reaction. I closed my journal and whispered, almost to myself, now what? Clarity creates options, and options require choice. For several days after the DNA results, I moved through life as usual. I went to work, I coordinated appointments, I smiled at patients, I answered emails from Lila about event logistics she assumed I would review. Externally, nothing shifted. Internally, everything had. I had three obvious paths in front of me. The first was confrontation. Drive to my parents' house, place the DNA report on the kitchen table, ask them why they never told me, demand explanation, demand emotional restitution. It would have been understandable. It might even have been cathartic. But confrontation, when driven by shock, often narrows outcomes. It forces defensiveness before reflection has a chance to breathe. The second option was silence through denial. Close the laptop, tear up the paperwork, decide that biology doesn't matter, continue playing the role I'd always played, preserve peace at the cost of clarity. That path was tempting in its familiarity, but it would require me to unknow what I now knew. And once truth settles into your spine, pretending otherwise fractures something deeper. The third option was irreversible, but not explosive. Integration without announcement. Restructuring my life quietly, with the knowledge fully absorbed before inviting anyone else into the conversation. That meant strengthening my independence, reviewing legal standing, preparing emotionally for responses that might not center my experience. It meant not reacting. It meant choosing timing instead of surrendering to it. I chose the third path, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted control over my own narrative for once. A week later, I invited my parents to dinner at my house. Not to confront them, not yet, just to observe. As we ate, my father began telling a story about our family temperament. He spoke about inherited stubbornness again, laughing as he gestured toward Lila. I watched him carefully. There was affection in his eyes, pride. When he looked at me, it was different. Not lesser, but softer, protective. I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There was no malice in the omission of truth. There was fear. Perhaps they believed they were protecting me. Perhaps they thought telling me would destabilize my sense of belonging. Perhaps they assumed blood mattered more than love. The irony was quiet. By hiding the truth, they had created the very instability they feared. After dinner, as my mother helped me clear plates, she paused. "You've seemed thoughtful lately," she said gently. "I am," I replied. She waited, as if expecting more. I didn't offer it, because the decision I had made required patience. The irreversible part wasn't confrontation. It was an internal separation from unquestioned loyalty. I stopped automatically identifying as the older sister responsible for Lila. I began identifying as Heidi, independent of origin. That shift changed my posture in subtle ways. When Lila called a few days later, asking if I could review a contract for her, I didn't say yes immediately. "I'll take a look if I have time," I answered evenly. There was a pause on the other end. She wasn't used to conditional language from me. "You always have time for this stuff," she laughed lightly. "Not always," I said calmly. It wasn't defiance. It was a boundary. The irreversible choice wasn't dramatic. It was this: I would no longer overfunction to compensate for dynamics rooted in an unspoken hierarchy. And when the conversation about blood finally happened, and it would, I would enter it from strength, not shock. That was the decision point. Not revenge, not rupture, repositioning. Because once you understand the architecture of your family, you can decide where you stand within it. And I was no longer willing to stand where I had been placed. Once the decision was made internally, the next phase was execution. Not emotional execution, structural. I scheduled a second meeting with the estate attorney, this time more specific. I brought copies of my amended birth certificate and adoption references from my pediatric file. "I'm not contesting anything," I clarified calmly. "I just want to understand my standing." The attorney nodded. In Oregon, adopted children have the same inheritance rights as biological children, unless explicitly excluded in a will. Unless explicitly excluded. Language matters. I requested copies of my parents' current estate documents, not because I distrusted them, but because informed adults review realities. When I asked my father casually if everything was updated equally between Lila and me, he waved his hand. Of course, you're both our daughters." "Both." The word landed differently now. I smiled. "I'd still like copies for my records." He looked mildly surprised, but not threatened. That was important. I wasn't accusing. I was normalizing transparency. At the same time, I began untangling smaller dependencies. I removed myself as co-signer on a small business line of credit that Lila had once asked me to guarantee, just temporarily. I framed it as a personal financial planning update. She was slightly irritated. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I'm reorganizing everything. I replied evenly. She sighed but didn't push further. For years, I had made myself quietly indispensable. I managed logistics, absorbed oversights, and stabilized narratives. Now I was stepping back, not dramatically, just precisely. At work, I accepted a leadership training opportunity I had previously declined because it required weekend commitments that overlapped with family gatherings. This time, I didn't check the family calendar first. I registered. When my mother later mentioned a Sunday lunch that conflicted, I responded calmly, "I have a training that day." "Oh," she said, surprised. "Can't you reschedule?" "No." The simplicity of that answer unsettled her more than anger would have, because anger is familiar. Calm autonomy is not. Meanwhile, I continued observing. Without my constant buffering, small tensions surfaced between Lila and our parents. Missed paperwork deadlines, overestimated projections, promises stretched thin. I didn't intervene, not to expose her, but to allow natural accountability. The most strategic shift, however, was internal. I stopped seeking validation through usefulness. For decades, my value in the family had been tied to reliability. Now I have detached identity from function. When Lila received praise for her entrepreneurial spirit at a family gathering, I listened without comparing, because bloodline no longer framed us as equals competing for the same genetic affirmation. We were two women raised in the same house, connected, yes, but not biologically mirrored. That difference released me from silent comparison. And here's what no one noticed. I began building relationships outside the family that weren't structured by history. Colleagues, mentors, friends who knew me only as Heidi, not the steady sister. In those spaces, my ambition wasn't contrasted. My caution wasn't diminished. It was respected. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means repositioning without announcement. By the time I felt ready to address the truth directly, I would not be standing on emotional quicksand. I would be standing on chosen ground. And when systems shift quietly, those within them rarely notice until the structure behaves differently. The consequences were beginning. They just didn't know it yet. The first consequences were almost invisible. No dramatic fallout, no accusations, just an imbalance revealing itself. When I stopped reviewing Lila's contracts, she missed a clause in a vendor agreement. It wasn't catastrophic, but it cost her time and money to renegotiate. She called me, frustrated. "Can you look at this? I think they slipped something in." "I can glance at it later this week," I said calmly. There was a pause. "You used to prioritize this stuff," she replied, not accusing, just confused. "I prioritize differently now." That was all. No explanation. No apology. At Sunday dinners, when conversations drifted toward financial planning or logistics, I no longer stepped in automatically. Silences lingered longer. My father would look at Lila expectantly. She would deflect. "Well, Heidi's the expert in that." Sometimes I stayed quiet long enough for the responsibility to sit where it belonged. Sometimes I said, "You two can handle it." It unsettled them. Not because I was hostile, but because I was no longer predictably stabilizing. My mother began calling more frequently, not to ask for help directly, but to check in. "Is everything okay?" she would ask. "Yes," I'd respond truthfully. "You seem distant." "I'm just focused," which was also true. Distance is often simply the absence of overextension. At work, my leadership training was progressing well. I was being considered for a supervisory position, something I had once assumed would complicate family expectations. Now, it felt aligned. One evening, during a small gathering at my parents' house, an interesting shift occurred. An uncle asked Lila about her projected revenue for the year. She answered confidently, but vaguely. Usually I would have clarified details quietly later. This time I didn't. He pressed for specifics. She stumbled slightly, not disastrously, just noticeably. Afterward, she pulled me aside. "Why didn't you jump in?" she asked, a hint of irritation beneath her composure. "Why would I?" I replied evenly. "Because you always help smooth things." I looked at her carefully. "Maybe I don't need to smooth everything." She stared at me, trying to interpret whether that was criticism. It wasn't. It was a boundary. Meanwhile, my parents began expressing subtle discomfort. Family gatherings felt less cohesive. Conversations were less orchestrated. Minor logistical oversights surfaced. Nothing severe, just friction. And friction reveals reliance. One afternoon, my father asked if I could help reorganize some investment documents. "I can give you a referral to someone excellent," I said. He blinked. "You're not available?" "I'm focusing on my own portfolio right now." It wasn't rejection. It was a recalibration. What fascinated me most was this. They didn't feel anger. They felt loss. Loss of predictability. Loss of invisible labor. Loss of the structure I had quietly provided. But they didn't yet understand why. From their perspective, I had simply changed. From mine, I had clarified. The truth about our bloodline hadn't created division. It had removed the distortion. And without distortion, roles had to stand on merit, not assumption. Layla began reaching out more frequently, not for help, but for reassurance. Are we okay? She asked one evening over coffee. We're fine, I answered, which was technically true. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't competing. I was simply no longer orbiting her. And when you step out of someone's gravitational field, they feel the shift before they understand it. The consequences had begun, not as an explosion, but as exposure. Exposure of who carried what. Exposure of who relied on whom. Exposure of dynamics that had once felt seamless. And still I hadn't spoken the truth aloud. Not yet. Because timing matters. And clarity deserves a steady platform, not emotional turbulence. They were beginning to sense something was different, but they still didn't know why. The unraveling didn't arrive all at once. It came in questions. Soft at first, then persistent. My mother invited me to lunch alone one afternoon, a small cafe we used to visit when I was in college. She stirred her tea longer than necessary before speaking. Have we done something? She asked quietly. It wasn't defensive. It was uncertain. I considered the question carefully. No, I said, not recently. She looked relieved, but only slightly. You feel further away? I feel clearer, I replied. That word unsettled her. Clear implies prior distortion. She hesitated. About what? I could have told her then. I could have placed the DNA report between us, the pediatric note, and the amended certificate. But something in her posture, something fragile, told me she already knew this moment would come someday. And fear was sitting just beneath her composure. Instead of accusing, I asked gently, why didn't you ever tell me I was adopted? The spoon in her hand stilled. There it was. No denial. No confusion. Just stillness. Her eyes filled, not dramatically, but with something heavier than surprise. Oh, Heidi, she whispered. Not shocked. Recognition. The conversation unfolded quietly. Yes, they had adopted me as an infant. Yes, it had been a closed adoption. Yes, they intended to tell me when I was older. But older never seemed like the right time. They feared I would feel separate, feared I would feel less chosen, feared it would fracture our bond. So they preserved silence, and silence preserved the imbalance. I never wanted you to feel different, my mother said, her voice trembling slightly. I held her gaze. I did, I replied calmly. I just didn't know why. That sentence broke something in her, not dramatically, but irreversibly. Because intent doesn't erase impact. And once truth is spoken, it can't be resealed. That evening, my father called me. My mother had told him we talked. We were trying to protect you, he said, his voice steady but strained. I know, I answered. And you are our daughter. That never changes. I know that too. But what they were beginning to understand, what couldn't be undone, was this. Their silence had shaped my self-perception for decades. I had interpreted subtle favoritism as personal deficiency. I had internalized genetic language as hierarchy. I had overcompensated to earn belonging that was already legally mine. Had they told me early, openly, the narrative would have been different. But now adulthood reframes everything. And reframing doesn't revert. Lila called the next day. Mom told her. Her reaction was complicated. Why didn't you tell me? She asked it. I didn't know until recently, I replied. There was a long silence. I never saw you as different, she said. I know, I answered. And I believed her. Her advantage had been unconscious, her pedestal unexamined. But unconscious privilege still shapes dynamics. And once awareness enters, innocence shifts. I guess this explains some things, she said quietly. It explains structure, I replied. What none of them fully grasped yet was this. The damage wasn't in the adoption. It was in the omission. And omission, once exposed, cannot be undone. Trust doesn't shatter in noise. It recalibrates in silence. They wanted to reassure me, to insist nothing had changed. But something had. Not love. Power. The unspoken hierarchy had been illuminated. And once illuminated, it cannot return to shadow. They couldn't fix what had already shaped me. They could only acknowledge it. And acknowledgement, while necessary, doesn't rewind identity. It simply clarifies it. The truth was finally on the table. But we were no longer the same people who had sat there before. The full conversation happened on a Sunday evening, not on a holiday, not during an argument, just an ordinary day that no one would remember for any other reason. We sat in my parents' living room, the same beige couch, the same framed family photos lining the walls, birthdays, graduations, beach vacations, evidence of history. Lila sat across from me, unusually quiet. My mother's hands were folded tightly in her lap. My father leaned forward slightly as if bracing for impact. There was no impact, just clarity. I'm not angry, I began. That seemed to surprise them. I'm not here to accuse anyone of not loving me. My mother exhaled softly. But I need you to understand something, I continued. The silence shaped me. I explained, not emotionally, not theatrically, how I had internalized difference as deficiency, how the constant references to bloodline traits had made me feel adjacent, how I overcompensated to earn a place that had already been legally mine. No raised voices, no tears, just facts delivered calmly. Lila listened intently. I never meant to overshadow you, she said quietly. I know, I replied, but intent doesn't erase pattern. That sentence lingered. My father cleared his throat. We thought telling you might make you feel separate. It did, I answered. The room stilled, not because I was attacking them, but because I was naming something that had lived unspoken for decades. I needed the truth, I said, not protection from it. My mother's voice was small. Are you going to pull away from us? I considered the question carefully. I'm not pulling away, I said. I'm repositioning. They didn't immediately understand, so I clarified. I'm still your daughter. I still care about this family. But I won't overextend to prove belonging anymore. That was the boundary. Not abandonment, not punishment, realignment. Lila spoke again, more thoughtfully this time. Does this change how you see me? I paused. It changes how I compare, I answered. She blinked slightly. For years, I measured myself against traits that were never biologically mine to inherit, I continued. Now I don't. There was no hostility in my tone, just relief. And in that relief, something softened between us. Because without unconscious competition for genetic affirmation, there was space for actual individuality. My father nodded slowly. We can update the estate documents again if you're worried. I'm not worried, I replied. I've already reviewed everything. That caught their attention. Of course I had. And in that moment, they saw something they hadn't fully recognized before. I wasn't fragile. I wasn't destabilized. I was steady, by choice, not obligation. The conversation ended without a dramatic reconciliation. No one hugged tightly in cinematic fashion, but something more durable occurred. Acknowledgement. They saw the structure. They saw my autonomy. And most importantly, they understood that the version of me who absorbed everything silently no longer existed. Confrontation without heat is powerful, because it leaves no emotional debris to distract from the truth. And when truth is delivered calmly, it becomes difficult to dismiss. We didn't solve everything that night, but we reset the foundation. And the foundation, once rebuilt, holds differently. It has been a year since that Sunday evening. Nothing in my life looks dramatically different from the outside. I still live in Portland. I still work in healthcare administration, though now in a supervisory role. I still attend family gatherings. I still sit at the same dining table during holidays. But internally, I am not the same woman who once believed belonging had to be earned through usefulness. Knowing the truth didn't fracture my identity. It clarified it. For decades, I measured myself against invisible genetic yardsticks. Confidence, charisma, risk tolerance. I interpreted differences as shortcomings because I assumed we were built from identical foundations. We weren't. And that realization released comparison entirely. Lila and I no longer exist as contrasting halves of the same bloodline. We exist as two women raised under one roof, connected by history, not biology. That distinction has softened our dynamic. I don't overfunction for her anymore. She doesn't expect me to. When she shares ambitious ideas, I listen without automatically managing outcomes. When I speak about my work, I no longer preface my achievements with disclaimers. I was promoted last quarter, I told the family recently. No softening, no minimizing. Just a fact. My father nodded with visible pride. My mother smiled, not protectively, but respectfully. They see me differently now. But more importantly, I see myself differently. I'm not the stable one because I lack spark. I am strategic because I choose to be. I am measured because I value precision. Those traits are not compensation. They are strengths. The emotional wound I carried, the quiet fear of being extra, tolerated but not essential, has dissolved. Because adoption, when spoken truthfully, is not conditional love. It is intentional love. And intentional love does not require performance to sustain it. There are still moments of adjustment. Language slips occasionally, references to our blood in casual storytelling. But now, instead of shrinking internally, I simply let it pass or gently redirect. No tension, no resentment, just awareness. The greatest shift has been this. I no longer orient my identity around family structure. I built friendships, professional networks, and mentorships, all spaces where I am known without backstory. And in those spaces, I am not the steady sister. I am Heidi, whole, defined by my own architecture. The irony is almost quite enough to miss. For years, I thought bloodline defined legitimacy. It doesn't. Integrity does. I don't regret the life I lived before knowing. It shaped resilience, observation, and emotional discipline. But I'm grateful for the truth. Because truth, even when delayed, restores proportion. And proportion allows you to stand upright without leaning into someone else's shadow. I am not adjacent anymore. I am central to myself, and that is enough. If you had asked me 2 years ago who I was, I would have answered in relation to other people. Older sister, reliable daughter, the steady one. I would have described myself through function, through usefulness, through proximity to someone else's brightness. But the day I discovered the sister I always considered my own is not related to me by blood, something fundamental shifted. Not because blood is everything, and not because love disappeared, but because truth replaced assumption. A truth about our bloodline changed everything I thought I knew about my sister. Yes, but more importantly, it changed everything I thought I knew about myself. It taught me that silence, even when rooted in protection, can distort identity. It taught me that comparison built on incomplete information will always wound quietly. And it taught me that you can love people deeply while still recalibrating your position within their lives. This was never a story about revenge. No one was exposed publicly. No inheritance was contested. No dramatic exits occurred. It was about quiet dominance, about choosing clarity over chaos, boundaries over bitterness, structure over spectacle. The most powerful shifts in life rarely happen in raised voices. They happen in private decisions, in documents reviewed carefully, in conversations held calmly, in identities redefined without announcement. I still love my family. I still show up. But I show up as someone who understands her origin, and therefore no longer seeks validation through overextension. And if you're listening to this and something inside you feels familiar, if you've ever sensed you were playing a role that didn't fully belong to you, if you've ever discovered a truth that quietly rearranged your internal world, I want to leave you with this. Belonging is not something you perform. It is something you understand. And sometimes understanding comes late. But the late truth is still truth. So I'm curious, if you discovered tomorrow that a foundational story about your identity wasn't complete, would you confront immediately or would you reposition quietly first? Tell me in the comments. I read them all.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.